And I would like to start by presenting the first speaker, which is Professor Charles Burnett. As Anna already mentioned, I don't think Professor Burnett, at least in Lisbon at the CIUHCT, it does not need much introduction, but still it is my pleasure just to say the briefest of his bio notes. So Professor Burnett is a professor of history of Arabic and Islamic influences in Europe at the Warburg Institute at the University of London. He has written on the transmission of texts, techniques, and artifacts from the Arab world to the West. He has written immensely. I do not even, attempt an overview of his production, which is not only immense, but of enormous significance to us all that work on those areas. But also on the Jesuits' engagement with Japan in the 16th and 17th centuries, a peculiarity of Professor Burnett's career, which in some sense distinguishes him from a typical historian of medieval Europe. And he has also produced very interesting work in this area. Among his publications are Arabic into Latin in the Middle Ages, the translators and their intellectual and social context, The Great Introduction to Astrology by Abu Mashar, this was with Keiji Yamamoto, and Humanism and the Jesuit Mission to China, the case of Duarte SANDE, 1547-1599. I would like to add two minor notes and one autobiographical note to conclude. The first two notes is that I think that the work that Professor Burnett has made in the transmission of Arabic knowledge to Latin Europe has been of utmost significance to the history of science and to the history of knowledge in general. And more specifically, from my point of view, his contributions to the history of numerals and arithmetic have been absolutely groundbreaking. So as you see, an enormous breadth of interests and contributions. Many years ago, I was very thin and I was not bold. At that time, I met Professor Burnett in Rábida. I still have very memorable memories of that occasion where he was very kind to me. And I do remember that he was in Rábida presenting a magnificent contribution, a paper on Jesuits in travel to Japan. So I have only fond memories of those events at so many years ago. And I truly believe that you will benefit a lot by hearing him again. It is truly a pleasure and an honor, Professor Burnett.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction and for Anna's introduction. I'm afraid I'm not going to say anything about Abbey Warburg, but I can say that we've got a very nice collection of books from the Portuguese Jesuits in Japan in our library, as well as so many other things in the library. I can also say that, well, bearing in mind that we're thinking about Helena Avelar, that she did inspire me with a love of Portugal and its history. And through her, I got to know so many very good Portuguese scholars who I do regard as being my friends. As for the subject of the conference, I'm not quite sure whether what I'm going to say is really central to the subject of arts and sciences. I really believe that it is necessary and illuminating to compare, well, to look at the relations between the arts and the sciences, or science and art. What I'm going to be talking about is specifically the bonae artes, which is another word for saying the literae humaniores in the late 16th century. So I hope that will fit in with other topics that are going to be discussed this morning. Between 1582 and 1586, 4 Japanese noble youths were introduced to glorious displays of Catholic culture in Europe and spent some time in Portugal, specifically Lisbon, Évora, and Coimbra, where they were entertained with plays and concerts. They were introduced to the latest navigational instruments, and they were meeting the leading figures of the time. They wrote down their experiences in a diary, which was translated into Latin by Duarte de Sande, the superior of the Jesuit mission in Macau, Far East. under the title De Missione Legatorum Japoniensium ad Romanam Curiam, about the mission of the ambassadors, the Japanese ambassadors, to the Roman Curia, i.e. to the papal court, which was part of their journey, but only one part of their journey. Today, I would like to speak about an unsung Portuguese humanist, a product of the Portuguese Renaissance, and his part in describing the visit of the 4 Japanese boys to Portugal, particularly Lisbon, Coimbra, and Avelar, which we call the Tencho embassy. Tencho after the period, the regal period, imperial period in Japan, and the Tencho dynasty. And it was an embassy because certain leading figures, called daimyo in Japanese, sent representatives as ambassadors, as it were, to Europe, and those were these 4 Japanese noble boys. The name of this humanist is Duarte de SANDE, and only recently has his life and works been assessed and valued by scholars such as Americo de Costa Ramalho, Joseph Moran, and Derek Massarella, in conjunction with their translation of the Tencho ambassador's diary into Portuguese and English respectively. Henrique has kindly also mentioned my own contribution to this research in my article Humanism and the Jesuit Mission to China. I will be repeating quite a lot of information, but I hope that I will be also giving new information in regard to that article. Duarte de SANDE was born probably in one of the villages called SANDE in the vicinity of the first capital of Portugal, Guimarães, in 1546 or 1547. He studied Latin and 1 year of canon law in Coimbra before he entered the Jesuit order at the age of 16. In the Jesuit house of Saint Roch in Lisbon. He studied philosophy and then theology at the College of Arts in Coimbra, rather one would say the university in Coimbra. But in 1568, he started to teach Latin in the Jesuit College of Braga until 1571, and then in Coimbra from 1571 to 1574. He returned to the study of theology and in 1578 was invested with the office of Prefect of Studies in Braga. We thus see him actively engaged in the literae humaniores, the bonae artes, for almost 15 years. But on March the 24th, 1574, his life took a radical new direction. He embarked on a ship sailing from Lisbon to Goa in India with a group of Jesuit missionaries over which he was given charge. They included people who became eminent for their missionary and their literary work, Rudolfo Acquaviva, who served in the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar the Great, Michele Ruggieri, the great Chinese linguist who became the first superior of the Jesuit Chinese mission, and above all, Matteo Ricci, probably the best known of these missionaries, who was the first European to enter the forbidden city of Beijing, Peking. The voyage took 6 months, which was plenty of time for Duarte to get to know these eminent scholars. Duarte spent 7 years in India. He became the rector of the Jesuit College of Bassein near Bombay, and then prefect of studies at the College of Goa. He was in Goa when the Tencho embassy passed through on its way to Europe. Little did he know that several years later, he would be translating the diaries of these ambassadors into Latin. In 1585, Alessandro Valignano, the visitor, an official title, of the province of India, replaced Michele Ruggieri with Duarte de SANDE as superior of the Jesuit Chinese mission. De SANDE alternated his residences in mainland China and in Macau, which of course belonged to the Portuguese. Such was his proficiency in Chinese that he swapped his teaching of Latin for teaching in Chinese, to young priests and missionaries. I quote the Latin, ad sinicas literas perdiscendas, totus intentus. He was completely engaged, focused on learning Chinese letters. Duarte acquired a great reputation as a humanist. Valignano wrote in Portuguese of de Sande's learning, I quote, and the reputation that he holds of being a great humanist, grande humanista, as much in Portugal as here, referring to Macau. And he also wrote, Valignano wrote in Latin, that he was once dedicated to the study of the humanities, olim studiis humanitatis dedito. Unusually, he at first wrote his annual letters, the Jesuits wrote annual letters to their headquarters in Rome, from wherever they happened to be. So he first wrote his annual letters from Braga and Bassein in Latin, and when he switched to Portuguese, he still included many Latin quotations. He couldn't help using Latin so much in his life. It is worth noting that the Jesuits had very strict and advanced ways of teaching Latin together with Greek and Hebrew for more advanced scholars in their colleges. The ratio studiorum of the Jesuits put the humanities at the core of the curriculum, dividing them into grammatica, historia, poetica, and rhetorica, which were preparatory for the higher faculties in the University of Philosophy and Mathematics. The most advanced college was that of Coimbra, which had been given to the Jesuits by King John III of Portugal in 1555. Students were attracted from all over Europe and included, among others, typically Christopher Clavius, who became the teacher of Galileo and whose Latin translation of Euclid's Elements was in turn translated into English by Billingsley with the famous preface of John Dee, and into Chinese by Matteo Ricci. Most conspicuous were the festivals at the Coimbra College in honor of John III, who'd given the college to the Jesuits, and especially in honor of Queen Elizabeth, Isabel of Portugal, who died in 1336, who was the patron saint, as it were, of the college. This last festival, which was held at the beginning of the school year, included speeches, poetry competitions, solutions of enigmas, and the presentation of prizes to the victors, and the festival would end with a dramatic presentation. A choice of the pieces composed for these festivals was published. De Sande contributed to several of these events. 3 poems written in 1568, his last year as a student in Coimbra, in honor of Queen Elizabeth, written in elegiac couplets. Once he had become a teacher of Latin at the same college, several more of his works were published, including a speech accompanying the presentation of the baccalaureate to the students in 1572, and an enigma concerning the league which the Pope had attempted to set up amongst Christian leaders to follow up the victory over the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto in October 1571. In this enigma, it's a poem which is enigmatic and has to be explained in a competition between students, and the student who explains the enigma most correctly gets a prize. In this enigma, composed by de Sande, the protagonists were replaced with the figures of classical mythology. The Turk is a boar from the Hyperborean mountains, because the Turks came from Scythia, north of the Black Sea, present-day Ukraine, unfortunately. And their destruction is similar to that of the Caledonian boar, which ravaged the fields of Oeneus in Aetolia. The Turks were identified with Artemis or Diana, who sent the boar in revenge for Oeneus' neglect of her worship, because they both used the symbol of the crescent moon. Atalante was the first to harm the boar, but she is helped by Astrea, who personified just conduct in battle. The classical allusions are explained in the published version of the poem by notes in Latin. A second enigma of 1572 refers to the Jesuit College of Coimbra itself in terms of an allegory in which the university is a venerable matron, her sons are the two laws, her daughters are theology and medicine. The funds for her upkeep are a maidservant. All these are explained in notes in Portuguese. The purpose of the poem seems to get funding for a new building for the Jesuit college, in which the old man personifying the college, which is dilapidated and old by now, you see, will become young again. So I'm just giving you some idea of de Sande's poetic talents. His prose and poetry is written in the highest quality of Latin. One poem begins with an allusion to Virgil's Aeneid 1:327, "O quam te memorem," or how shall I speak of you. Another to the blowing of a light breeze, the aurae levis flatu, or flatus, which had already been mentioned. Divisions of their classes, their festivals at the beginning of each year, the orations, enigmas, theatrical and musical performances. No doubt Duarte, de Sande, composed more poems and speeches for these colleges, but they haven't survived. But many of his annual letters from Goa and Bassem are still extant. As I say, these are generally in Latin. When Valignano invited de Sande to translate the diary of the Tencho princes, noble boys, into Latin, he professed, de Sande professed that his Latin was rather rusty because he had spent so much time engaged in the more difficult task of learning Chinese. He uses an expression taken from an epigram of Martial, "Severiores musas colere." I am cultivating more stringent, more severe muses. And he says this is to such an extent that his Latin might sound rather like Chinese. Sermo noster cynicum potius quam Latinum sonare, which is a curious thing to say. There is, however, no evidence that this is the case in the translation of the De Missione of the Four Japanese Boys, which appeared in 1590 on the press, which had lately been brought back. They had been brought back from Europe with the four boys on the ship back to Macau, and it was one of the first things to be printed on this newly introduced press. On the contrary, his Latin is not Chinicized, but he went to a great extent to classicize his Latin and eschewed neologisms or any word that was not used in ancient Rome. Thus, he substituted academia for universitas, templum for ecclesia, and of course, always referred to Portugal as Lusitania, the ancient province of the Roman Empire. Moreover, in the preface to his translation, he claimed that the Dialogus de Missione itself had been composed to teach, amongst other things, correct Latin to Japanese children. He described the Latin language as more maturious than the language which the Tencho boys had been using to write their diaries. So comparing Latin with the vernacular. Thus, we have Duarte de Sande, a humanist and poet, a Latin scholar and teacher who had become fluent in Chinese, committed to translating into Latin and putting into order, including the dialogue, into the dialogue form, the diary of the Tencho princes, which had presumably been written in Portuguese, but which Alessandro Valignano, the Jesuit visitor to the Far East, had organized, put into order in Spanish. The dialogue is between the four teenage boys, Mikhail, representing the daimyo, the prince of Amura and Arima, Mancio, representing the daimyo of Bungo, Julian and Martin, their relatives. And they are depicted as being in discussion with Leo and Lino, who had stayed in Japan. And so the whole thing takes the form of Leo and Lino asking them, what happened? What did you experience? Tell us more about this, and so on. We don't know anything about such and such a European artifact. Tell us about it. The resultant text is a mixture of chapters called colloquia, conversations, on successions of events. So the diary form, as it were, saying this happened, and after this we did this, and chapters devoted to specific topics, the monarchy, always in Europe, of course, the monarchy, administration, wars, church liturgy, etc. Since we do not have anything from before the De Missione or the SANDE's intervention, we cannot tell just how much the SANDE changed, developed, or added to the material in front of him. There has been much controversy as to whether the true author of the De Missione was Valignano, who wrote the Spanish version, not yet a dialogue, or Duarte de Sande himself, which is the more recent opinion of Americo da Costa Ramalho. These are the passages relevant to the glory of Portugal. The stopping points on the voyage from Macau to Lisbon were all Portuguese territories. Malacca, Goa, described as the headquarters of Christianity, and finally Santa Helena, in the middle of the Atlantic, the isolated island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which had been discovered by the Portuguese settlers, just a few years earlier in the century. On their voyage, the boys became acquainted with the latest navigational instruments. I talked about this in Arabida many years ago, as Henrique mentioned just now, which were being used for the observation of the stars, the astrolabe, a naval chart, and a compass or needle, all these things being new to the Japanese. I quote, "With the astrolabe, one finds from the exact position of the sun the distance either to the pole or to the equator. With the chart, the naval chart, on which all the turns of the shoreline are described, one can find by means of compasses the place where one has reached. One can recognize a portolan chart with rhumb lines indicating directions. With the needle, which indicates north and south, one knows which direction to take. Each of these instruments is then described in detail." So this just gives one example of, the technical details that we can find in De Missione, associated especially here with the Portuguese ship that they were sailing on. The arrival in Lisbon is discussed at the end of the 6th colloquium. Michael tells Leo that they came into the port of Lisbon on the 10th of August, 1584. They were confronted with an almost infinite multitude of ships of all kinds. In fact, several kinds of ship are listed, which could form a nice catalogue of the shapes and purposes of different ships. He continues, "As to the appearance of that vast city of Lisbon, who could do justice to it? Magnificent houses, lofty buildings, the high structures of walls and towers, all present themselves to the beholder, who has difficulty in deciding which to admire more: the scale of the city, the magnificence of the buildings, the great size of the churches, or the infinite multitude of people, especially when one compares this with the cities in Japan." The reader is directed to a later colloquium devoted entirely to describing Lisbon, namely colloquium 16, entitled De Scribitur Olisipo, the Latin form of the name Lisbon, Caput Lusitani Regni, the capital of the Portuguese kingdom. So to turn to this description, first of all, one might say that it's modeled on other descriptions of cities. I mean, the best known of these in the Renaissance is Leonardo Bruni's praise of Florence, which was written in 1400, sometime before, but there is a genre of praising one's own city. In fact, here we're praising the city of Lisbon. It is praised as being the place from which the Christian religion has spread throughout all the regions of the East. The Portuguese had not only banished the Muslims from their territory in the 12th century, but had also reached out to Oriental peoples to show them the signs of salvation, the signa salutatis. We get some idea of the self-importance of the Portuguese in the celebration of their first king, Afonso Henrique, to whom, according to SANDE, the Portuguese owed more than to Ulysses, the alleged founder of Lisbon, hence the name Ulysses, because it's named after the ancient mythical, the legendary figure of Ulysses. The Portuguese are proud of their kings, which are named in order by de Sande, so you have a bit of history here, and mentioned as defeaters of the Saracens, as people who crossed into North Africa, and as great intellects and philosophers. The epitome of the philosophy king is John III. Much praise is lavished on Lisbon as having no equal among the cities of Europe. It owes its richness to the presence of so many foreigners, a cosmopolitan society, which have increased after Portugal has come into the hands of King Philip II, after which, the very recent union of the crowns of Portugal and Spain in 1580. Lisbon itself, that's probably added for political reasons, I suppose, but Lisbon itself includes, I quote, 2 very considerable cities, fortifications with 38 gates and 77 towers, more than 130 churches and 6 royal palaces of the utmost magnificence. Numerous nobles who administer other regions of Portugal have houses in the city because of the salubrity of the climate, I hope that's true, and the closeness of the king. In addition, there are 7 hospitals, which are a sign of the beneficence of the kings. Especially notable is the Jerónimo monastery, founded in 1501. De Sande then goes on to describe the topography of the city, which, as he says, is 2 cities because it's divided down the middle. It is the shape of a bow and arrow, the arrow divided down the middle. The maritime shore, I quote, is stretched out like the string from which the central part of the city extends like the arrow, while the sides, the edges of the city, which contain 2 very large hills, take the form of the bow. The harbour area is singled out for comment because of the huge ships setting out from there to India, i.e. the Far East. The public fountains are described, including the wondrous King's Fountain, which, I quote, is constructed of marble with workmanship of superb artistry, which receives water which gushes out not far away, and it flows out through broad and skillfully worked orifices to be collected by an almost infinite number of slaves or servants, even at the dead of night. The main streets are described one by one, each dedicated to a different craft: cloth merchants, goldsmiths, silversmiths, engravers and sculptors, and even a street devoted entirely to selling sugar. Then there are the major buildings, the Hospital of All Saints, the Royal Foundation, which has special rooms for the poor, for foundlings, for the mentally sick, for the nobility who cannot be cared for in their own homes, and for the religious. Then there is the Monastery of Saint Dominic, and then the Royal Palace and several other monasteries. The last of the buildings to be described are a magnificent prison, the cathedral, and last of all, the Church of St. Anthony, the flower and ornament of the Franciscan order. In the last case, de Sande introduces a classical Latin word, quos triumviros appellare licet, for the magistrates administrating the city, the triumvirs. And other classical allusions abound. The city is described as a kind of Trojan horse from which Portuguese soldiers can burst out into the Far East. The story is told how Achilles, as a baby, was hidden in a temple of Vestal virgins, now the convent of Helena, dressed as a girl, to prevent him from knowing about the Trojan War. But Ulysses, the founder of Lisbon, found him. And this just goes on to show, as de Sande says, that Lisbon must be much older than any other European city. While the description of Lisbon concentrates on the topography and the buildings of the city, the account of Coimbra concentrates on the university and the Jesuit college. This is the topic of the 31st colloquium and immediately precedes the return voyage to Japan. The title of the colloquium is De Urbe Conimbrica et Celebri in ea Societatis Collegio. Given de Sande's familiarity with Coimbra, it is highly likely that he added some details to the account in the diaries that he was translating. The buildings, revenues, teachers and subjects taught in the college are described. But what takes up most of the space is the account of the celebrations that the different classes in the college held for the visiting Japanese boys. These included a dialogue, an oration, a tableau, and a pageant featuring the personas of Asia, Ocean, Europe, Portugal, Castile, and Italy. The subject matter of all these performances was, or is, the triumph of faith in Japan and the success of the Tencho embassy. The climax of the celebrations was a play concerning the life of John the Baptist, which was remarkable, according to Sande, for its realism, its stage scenery, and its music. All these described. Americo de Costa Ramalho has identified this play with the tragedy on John the Baptist written by Antonio de Abreu. In giving a detailed account of these celebrations, de Sande is obviously encouraging his hoped-for audience in Japan, in the Japanese seminaries, to follow the example of the foremost Jesuit college in Europe. The third city to which de Sande gives attention is Évora, and especially to the Jesuit college there, which included residences for the Jesuit fathers and with access to abundant running water. They seem to have water on the tap, as it were. In fact, sophisticated waterworks seem to characterize the whole city in that it was supplied by aqueducts hidden under the earth for a league and a half and then gradually rising for the remaining half league. And the so-called silver water, which was brought in these aqueducts, then flowed into 4 very artistically finished and public fountains, which had many mouths and into which individual fountains of the monasteries and the convents were connected. As with Lisbon, de Sande mentions the foundation of the city, this time by Quintus Sertorius, a Roman general who led the Iberian tribes, including the Lusitanians, in a rebellion against Rome. The 4 Japanese princes left Lisbon on the 12th of April, 1586, to the accompaniment of Ate Deum, which resounded throughout around the harbour. I wonder whether this could have been the Te Deum written by Pedro de Cristo, a Baroque, well-known Portuguese Baroque composer, who was born in 1545 or 1550 and educated in Coimbra. He could have been old enough to have composed the music for this Te Deum. The De Missione was published on the press that Alessandro Valignano brought to Macau in 1590, as I have mentioned, and was a very substantial work. I mean, even in the translation by into Portuguese, it's in 2 volumes here of 800 pages. Whether or not it followed closely the words of the Tencho ambassadors, it expressed a patriotic, if not chauvinistic, attitude towards Portugal, emphasizing the impressiveness of its monuments, the sophistication of its engineering, whether of astrolabes or of aqueducts or fountains, and the water supply, and the high quality of its learning, especially in the humanities. Duarte de Sande gives us an image of the country in the late Renaissance, which was in many ways at the height of its glory, and he shows himself to be a Renaissance man in his pursuit of the literae humaniores, a true humanist who deserves greater recognition as a Portuguese hero. And I shall stop here and would be very happy to talk more about any part of this topic.
Thank you so much, Professor Burnett, for such a marvelous talk and introduction to this workshop. So now I think we have some time for discussion. So if anyone wants to ask someone to Charles Burnett, please do. Okay, Henrique. And then Samuel.
Thank you very much. It was, fascinating as always. Thank you very much. I have a question, which is the following. We have immense evidence of Jesuit interest for the details of Japanese culture, not only artistic, etc., or even day-to-day behavior, meals.
Yep.
But my question is, do we find this also in the Duarte de Sande's text, or is it mostly the other way around because of the whole nature of this embassy? Is it more a display and presentation of European and Portuguese culture, but also Italian, Roman, etc.? Or does the text also convey some information and identifies some interest of the Jesuits for the information that the four young kids could say about this culture?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, of course, the whole purpose of the De Missione was to introduce European culture to the Japanese, but in that it takes a dialogue form. Those Leo and Lido who remained in Japan are always depicted as saying, well, we do this, we do something different. And this, as it were, brings the whole discussion closer to the Japanese so that is understood and identified with, so that the Japanese seminarians sort of identify themselves with Leo and Lino, wanting to know more about European culture, and at the same time wanting to know what is different about European culture. So you have many allusions, references to Japanese culture. For example, the Japanese sit on the ground, whereas Europeans sit in chairs. Japanese music is monophonic and boring. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say boring, but always on one tone, no modulation, whereas European music is polyphonic and always modulating. There are different ways of expressing of greeting people in Japan from Europe. So we have a lot of information, which is first-hand information, of course, because it is from the diaries of the Japanese boys themselves. Not as much as, well, there are other, as you mentioned, there are other books, especially the book by Frois, in which is actually set out as differences between Japan and Europe in the customs and in the religion and in the philosophy of both countries, both parts of the world. But there's a surprising amount of information about Japanese culture in the De Missione as well.
Yes, Samuel?
Yes, thank you so much, Charles. It's just great to hear this story about Duarte de Sandes, which I'm totally ignorant, and so it has been fascinating. My question goes into a similar direction as Henrique's. What is your analysis of the audience Duarte has in mind, and what do you think about his is he merely translating something, or is he actually creating this diary?
These are such important questions. First of all, it is Valignano who actually commissions this, asked. So we're looking at Alessandro and Valignano, who was really the driving force for introducing for the mission to Japan. Secondly, the whole point, if you like, of the mission to Japan was to Europeanize the culture, one might say, by putting Latin at the very heart of the education to start off with. And there are phrases, even in the De Missione, in which people are described as not being Europeanized enough, Thirdly, as for the audio, as for the creativity of Duarte, the SANDE, and that's difficult to judge because, as I say, we don't have the previous versions, but whether it's the diary of the boys themselves or Valignano's putting into this diary into Spanish and into order, as it said, all we know is that Duarte SANDE was commissioned to put it into a dialogue form so that it would be easier to read, and also to set in order. And one does get the impression that he has, in fact, used his own experiences, especially in Coimbra and Lisbon, to flesh out, as it were, the material that he has before him. And as for the audience is specifically described as being these Japanese boys in the seminaries. It's a teaching manual for the Jesuit schools set up in several places in Japan. And we are told in the preface that it's going to be translated into Japanese so that people who didn't know Latin, i.e. those who were not in these seminaries, could also read the text. Unfortunately, we have no evidence that that Japanese translation was ever made, but it was printed in 1,000 copies, on this new press in Macau, which is an enormous number of books. But we only have evidence for the use of the Latin text and not the Spanish translation. But one thing I tried to emphasize in the previous article was that in spite of their reputation for accommodation, the Jesuits did believe that Christian European culture was superior to any other culture, and this is what other people should be done. So the actual culture within the schools, the teaching within the schools was very, very similar in Amakusa, for example, as it was in Coimbra.
Yes, please, Henrique.
Yeah,
Thank you, Professor.
I'm returning to the questions because of a comment that you made about the quality of the teaching of Latin. So now I would like to, by the Jesuits at this period. So you may know that in the 18th century, so much the 18th century, there was a massive critique to the pedagogical techniques of the Jesuits in Portugal.
Yes.
And the core of this critique was a critique to the way they were teaching Latin, which was to be very, old and conservative and wooden, not.
I'm not surprised. Yeah.
So this was in the 18th century. So my question, and I would like to hear you more about this. So it is evident for you, or there is evidence for this, that the teaching of Latin was innovative in the 16th century. Say mid-16th, second half of the 16th.
Yes. Well, I mean, this is a big subject. There were very, very strict rules about how you taught Latin. There were textbooks. and certainly the ratio studiorum went into great detail. And as I say, you had the basic grammar, and then and eventually you had rhetoric, so that you could actually preach in Latin. And that is the reason why the Jesuits put so much emphasis on the theatre too, so that the boys could become familiar with spoken Latin and persuasive Latin. It was very much a living language, as it were, for them, even though it was a learned language. I'm not, this is probably not quite relevant, but I was just reading some very fine work by someone called Takao Harris, Makoto Takao Harris, who is showing how the Jesuits, when they were in China and Japan, realized that their audience would not immediately understand Latin. So they used non-textual ways of persuading people, i.e. Art and music, images and music, until they were able to actually read the texts and recite and take part in the liturgy and understand what was going on and so on. But so Latin was not the only means of communication, or until the Jesuits themselves became familiar with the native languages, because that took some time to. But the history of Latin in general in the 18th century was starting to be eroded, as it were, by the vernacular languages as the language of communication. But this is a big story, and the Jesuits are part of it.
I think.
Yes, thank you so much. So Sylvie Devart, how are you? Thank you for participating, for being here. Obrigada, Sylvie.
Thank you very much, Professor Burnett, because I read many times, or a few times, Duarte, but I did not remember the image of bow and arrow for the city of Lisbon.
Yes,
it is fascinating. I know the emblematic culture.
Yes.
Of Jesuits.
Yes.
But, can you tell me more about this image? Very important.
Well, it would be very interesting if it occurs elsewhere, but certainly de Sande finds it very convenient to describe the topography of the city of Lisbon in terms of the string of the bow, which is the coastline, of course, the arrow, which I imagine is as much the Tau, as much the river, as the spread in an elongated way of the city inland, going inland. And the bow itself being the mountains surrounding the city. Whether there is any symbolism of the bow and arrow as representing Lisbon, I don't know, but it's a convenient way of mapping it, as it were.
Yes, but it's the first time it is used. This image is used for the city.
Really? Yes.
I think so. But don't you think it would be an evocation of the Portuguese going out?
Well,
around the world.
Well, the phrase is used that they are flung out of Lisbon in very many different directions, but especially to the Far East. Yes. Righto, like
the impulsion out of Europe.
Yes, well, yes. I mean, the SANDE probably knows the importance of the bow and arrow in Japanese culture too, the yumi, where you
cultures.
yes, hitting the target and intense concentration on what you are doing. Yes,
they know it all.
Right.
The target.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Okay, thank you so much, Sylvie de Vartan.